ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಮಾನ್ಯ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು ನಾನು ಸಚಿನ್ ತೆಂಡೂಲ್ಕರ್ ಅಂತ. ಆದರೆ ಸಚಿನ್ ತೆಂಡೂಲ್ಕರ್ ಮತ್ತೆ ನನ್ನದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದು ಕಾಮನ್ ಫೀಚರ್ ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ಅವರು ಮಹಾರಾಷ್ಟ್ರದವರು, ನಾನು ಮಹಾರಾಷ್ಟ್ರದವನು ಅಷ್ಟೇ. ಅದು ಬಿಟ್ರೆ ನಾನು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಅಳಿಯ. ಅದರಿಂದ ಒಂದು ಸಮಸ್ಯೆ ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಈ ಒಂದು ಸಭಾಗೃಹದಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ರೈತ ಬಾಂಧವರು ಮತ್ತೆ ಭಗಿನಿಯವರು ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಹಿರಿಯರ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ದೇಶಗಳಿಂದ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತನಾಡುವಂಥದ್ದ ವಿಜ್ಞಾನಿಗಳು ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಯಾವ ಭಾಷೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಮಾತಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ, ಒಂದು ಯಕ್ಷ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆನೇ ತಾವು ಎದುರುಗಡೆ ಇಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀರಿ. ಸೊ ನಾನು ಒಂದು ಸಣ್ಣ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡುವ ಮುಂಚೆ ನಮ್ಮ ರೈತರ ಬಂಧು ಭಗಿನಿಗಳಿಗೆ ಒಂದು ತುಂಬಾ ಸಂಕ್ಷಿಪ್ತವಾಗಿ ನನ್ನ ಒಂದು ಮಾತಿದು ಸಾರಾಂಶವನ್ನು ಹೇಳಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಪಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಯಾಕಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಕೊನೆಗೆ ಅವರ ಮೂಲಕನೇ ಈ ಒಂದು ಸಮಸ್ಯೆದು ಪರಿಹಾರ ಆಗಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ. ಅದರಿಂದ ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಶುರು ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಈ ಮಾತಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಎರಡು ವಿಷಯಗಳನ್ನು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ನನ್ನ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನಗಳನ್ನು ತಮ್ಮ ಎದುರುಗಡೆ ಇಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಪಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಒಂದು, ನಾವು ಅರ್ಕಾವತಿ ನದಿಯ ಒಂದು ವಿಷಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಂಶೋಧನೆ ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ. ಅದರಿಂದ ಒಂದು ಸಂಕ್ಷಿಪ್ತವಾಗಿ 2-3 ಅಂಶಗಳನ್ನು ತಮ್ಮ ಎದುರಿಗೆ ಇಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು 2019ರಲ್ಲಿ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಜ್ಞಾನ ಆಯೋಗ ಒಂದು ಸಮಿತಿಯನ್ನು ರಚನೆ ಮಾಡಿತ್ತು. ಆ ಸಮಿತಿಯ ಮೂಲಕ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ರಾಜ್ಯದ ನೀರಿನ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನೀತಿ ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಒಂದು ಸಲಹೆ, ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್, ದಾಖಲೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ಜೊತೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ನೀತಿಯ ಒಂದು ಡ್ರಾಫ್ಟ್ ನಾವು ತಯಾರಿಸಿದೀವಿ. ಅದ್ರದ್ದು ಏನಾಯ್ತು ನನ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ಒಟ್ಟಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಅದು ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಹತ್ರ ಇದೆ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಬೇರೆ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ 2022ರಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ನೀತಿ ಜಾರಿಗೆ ಬಂದಿದೆ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಈ ಒಂದು ನಾವು ಏನ್ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ 2019ರಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು 50 ಜನ ಸೇರಿ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ವತಿಯಿಂದ ಈ ಕೆಲಸವನ್ನು ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ. ಅದರಿಂದ ಸಂಕ್ಷಿಪ್ತವಾಗಿ ಕೆಲವು ಅಂಶಗಳನ್ನು ತಮ್ಮ ಎದುರಿಗೆ ಇಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಪಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಸೊ ಸಂಕ್ಷಿಪ್ತಗಳ ಒಂದು 3 ಅಂಶಗಳನ್ನು ನಾನು ತಮ್ಮ ಎದುರುಗಡೆ ಇಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಪಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಒಂದ್ ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ನಾವು ಇವತ್ತು ನೀರು ಮತ್ತು ಹವಾಮಾನ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಅಥವಾ ಹವಾಮಾನ ವೈಪರೀತ್ಯ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ಆದರೆ ಹವಾಮಾನ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಆಗುವ ಮುಂಚೆನೆ ನಮ್ಮ ನೀರಿನ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳು, ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಒತ್ತಡಗಳು ಇವೆ. ಹವಾಮಾನ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು, ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಒತ್ತಡ. ಇದಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಮುಂಚೆನೆ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಒತ್ತಡಗಳು. ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ನಮ್ದು ಗುರಿಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಇದು ಒಂದು ಗುರಿ. ಬರೀ ಇದನ್ನೇ ನಾವು ಎದುರುಗಡೆ ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿಕ್ಕೆ ಆಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಗುರಿಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಇದು ಒಂದು ಗುರಿ. ಇದು ನಾವು ಮರಿಬಾರದು. ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ನೀರು ಸೀಮಿತವಾಗಿ ಇರೋದ್ರಿಂದ, ವಾಟರ್ ಬೀಯಿಂಗ್ ಎ ಲಿಮಿಟೆಡ್ ರಿಸೋರ್ಸ್, ಅದರದ್ದು ಸಮಾನತೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಮತ್ತೆ ನ್ಯಾಯವಾದ ಪದ್ಧತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹಂಚಿಕೆ, ಇದು ಅತಿ ಮುಖ್ಯ ಗುರಿ ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಇದು ಒಂದು ನಮ್ಮ ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಕೊನೆಗೆ ಇದನ್ನು ಎದುರಿಸಬೇಕಿದ್ರೆ, ಈ ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳನ್ನು ನಾವು ಎದುರಿಸಬೇಕಿದ್ರೆ, ನಾವು ವಿಜ್ಞಾನದ ಆಧಾರದ ಮೇಲೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ಲೋಕ ಸಹಭಾಗಿತ್ವದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಜನರ ಸಹಭಾಗಿತ್ವದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವದಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಕೆಲಸವನ್ನು ನಡೆಸಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಆಡಳಿತವನ್ನು ಬದಲಾಯಿಸಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಈ ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ, ಈ ದಾಖಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಸರ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಸಲಹೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಈ ಒಂದು 3 ಅಂಶಗಳನ್ನು ನಾನು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಈಗ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಸ್ತೀರ್ಣವಾಗಿ ಇಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಪಡ್ತೀನಿ. ತಾವು ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ಕ್ಷಮಿಸಬೇಕು. ಇದರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಇನ್ನೂ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಬೇರೆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಚರ್ಚೆ ಮಾಡಬಹುದು. ಐ ವಿಲ್ ಸ್ವಿಚ್ ಟು ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ನೌ ಅಂಡ್ take the opportunity to thank the organizers and specifically Dr. Rajendra Poddar for giving me this opportunity to be here and be part of this event. A special mention for Professor Gopal Kadekodi, who is on the board of WALMI, one of my mentors and one of the early environmental economists to study watershed development in this country, to look at the success of participatory watershed development. Thank you, Professor Kadekodi, for being here. Also, namaste to Rajendra Singh ji for meeting after so many years and as a pioneer of participatory water management in the country. In summary, what I have presented in front of you are the 3 points that I want to make in this presentation. Number one, that yes, while climate change is an important and new stressor for the water system, we cannot forget that it is overlaid on pre-existing multiple stressors. And similarly, climate resilience is then one of many concerns that we have in the water sector. And if we want to confront these challenges, whether they are caused by climate change as a stressor or other pre-existing stressors, we need to move beyond supply side thinking. We need to move beyond vague mention of integrated water resource management to a science-based and democratic water governance. That's in short what I'm going to talk about, and I'll try to stick to the time that I have here. To make the first point, if you look at the status of water resources in Karnataka, we are already confronted with the challenge of drying rivers even before climate change hit us in a big way. And I'm presenting data here from Shekhar Muddu's work on the Hemavati River, where you can see that over the 3 decades from 1977 onwards, till 1990, you see a certain pattern, and after 2000 to 2011, in that decade, you see a much lower inflows into the Hemavati Reservoir, even if the rainfall is actually slightly higher in that year. So you cannot attribute the declining inflows to the impact of climate because the rainfall is actually higher. ಮಳೆ ನೀರು ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಬೀಳ್ತಾ ಇರೋದು, ಆದರೆ ಹೇಮಾವತಿ ಜಲಾಶಯಕ್ಕೆ ಬರತಕ್ಕಂಥ ನೀರು ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ ಈ ಒಂದು ಡೇಟಾದಿಂದ ನಾವು ತೋರಿಸಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಪಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ಕೆರೆಗಳು ಬತ್ತಿ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇರೋದು, ಕೆರೆಗಳು ಒಣಗಿ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇರೋದು ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಗೊತ್ತಿದ್ದ ವಿಷಯ. ತಿಪ್ಪೇಗೊಂಡನಹಳ್ಳಿ ಕೆರೆ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನ ಹತ್ತಿರದಲ್ಲಿ, ನಿಯರ್ ಬ್ಯಾಂಗ್ಳೂರ್, ವಿ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ವಾಟರ್ ಸಪ್ಲೈ ರಿಸರ್ವಾಯರ್ ಕಾಲ್ಡ್ ಟಿ.ಜಿ.ಹಳ್ಳಿ ರಿಸರ್ವಾಯರ್. And we can look at the inflows into ಟಿ.ಜಿ.ಹಳ್ಳಿ reservoir in this graph and see how the inflow pattern after 1974 or 1975 has declined dramatically over these years. And we did an investigation to see whether climate change was the cause, but that was not the case. I'll come back to that in a second. The third challenge, of course, is disappearing groundwater. The decline of groundwater in most parts of Bangalore is well known. And this particular map will show you the areas that are most adversely affected by the declining groundwater table in Karnataka. And finally, the issue of pollution. I mean, you just need to come to Bangalore, or go to virtually any city in Karnataka and look at the level of pollution, whether it is in the lakes or whether it is in the rivers, in the form of both domestic sewage and industrial pollutants. And finally, the question of inequity. ಇದು ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗಿಂತ ಮುಖ್ಯ ವಿಷಯ. ಇದು ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ನೀರಿನ ಅಸಮಾನತೆಯ ಹಂಚಿಕೆ. The distribution of water, whether it is in the domestic sector or the agricultural sector, is extremely inequitable. This particular study that Professor Deepak Malgan and I conducted for Bangalore show that while the mean supply or use of water in Bangalore was 120 liters per capita per day, the median was below 90, which means that more than 50% of the consumers were below 90 LPCD. And yet 10% are about 225 LPCDs. This is the kind of extreme inequality you have in the consumption of water in the city of Bangalore. The average consumption of the top 10% is 340 liters per capita per day, and the bottom 50% are below 90, with a very substantial number below 50 LPCD. If you come to the farming sector, I think many of us are already aware of the issue of inequitable distribution. We thought that the groundwater revolution would have an equalizing effect, because it, in a sense, frees people from the tyranny of being in the command area and allows them access to water wherever they are in the landscape. Our study in the Arkavati basin showed that, in fact, yes, initially when the borewell revolution happened, ಯಾವಾಗ ನಾವು ಕೊಳವೆ ಬಾವಿಗಳನ್ನು ನಾವು ಶುರು ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ, ಆವಾಗ ನೀರು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಸಿಗೋದು ಪ್ರಮಾಣ ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಆಗಿದೆ, ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಜನರಿಗೆ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದೆ. ಮುಂಚೆ ಯಾರಿಗೆ ನೀರಾವರಿ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅವರಿಗೆ ನೀರಿನ ಸೌಕರ್ಯ ಶುರು ಆಯಿತು. ಆದರೆ ಬೈ 2013 ಇದು 20% ಇಂದ ತಿರ್ಗಾ 15%ಗೆ ಇಳಿದಿದೆ. ಇಟ್ ಹಸ್ ಕಮ್ ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ ಟು 15%. Only 15% of the farmers have access to working borewells and therefore access to groundwater. And who are these 15%? These are the elite in our society. With large land holdings, upper caste and educated farmers are the ones that have got the remaining access to groundwater. ಎಲ್ಲರ ಹತ್ರ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಜಮೀನಿದೆ, ಎಲ್ಲರ ಹತ್ರ ಯಾರ ಹತ್ರ ಆರ್ಥಿಕತೆ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಇದೆ, ಅವ್ರು ಮಾತ್ರ ಈ ಕೊಳವೆ ಬಾವಿಯನ್ನ ಇವತ್ತು ನಡೆಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸೊ uncontrolled groundwater extraction, which has led to the dropping of groundwater levels, has very clearly aggravated the inequity that is already there in the access to groundwater and water resources in general in the farming sector. So in this context, we cannot only talk about climate resilience as the goal. ಹವಾಮಾನ ಬದಲಾವಣೆಗೆ ಎದುರಿಸಬೇಕು ಹೌದು, ಆದರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಗುರಿಗಳನ್ನು ನಾವು ಕಂಡುಹಿಡಿಯಬೇಕು. We have multiple concerns or goals in the water sector, and I have tried to illustrate them using 5 circles. I think all of us agree that adequacy and affordability for life and livelihood, this is an obvious goal that in theory all governments are pursuing. But take adequacy and affordability in an average manner. And then the second goal that often as environmentalists we bring to the fore is sustainability of the resource and resilience to climate change. We also talk about pollution, jalamalinyat ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನಾವು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತೀವಿ, and of course all environmental flows. But perhaps the least talked about goal, which is central to the water sector, is the issue of equity and justice. ಸಮಾನತೆ ಮತ್ತು ನ್ಯಾಯವಾದ ಪದ್ಧತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ನೀರಿನ ಹಂಚಿಕೆ, ಇದು ತೀರಾ ಮುಖ್ಯದ ಒಂದು ಗುರಿ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಇದಾಗಬೇಕಿದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಡೆಮೊಕ್ರಾಟಿಕ್ ಪದ್ಧತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಜನರ ಸಹಭಾಗಿತ್ವದಲ್ಲಿ ಮತ್ತೆ ಲೋಕಪ್ರಭುತ್ವದಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಒಂದು ಕೆಲಸವನ್ನು ಮಾಡಬೇಕು, ಆಡಳಿತವನ್ನು ನಡೆಸಬೇಕು. Our governance of the water sector must be democratic in a deepest sense. Not, of course, we have a democratically elected government in place, and the government of Karnataka takes decisions in that process. However, given that Karnataka, for example, and many states of India are the size of individual European nations, we need to think about decentralizing the governance process all the way down to the villages and creating a different form, a more deeper democratic governance process. Similarly, the question of climate change is not the only stressor in this sector. ಈ ನೀರಿನ ಮೇಲೆ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಒತ್ತಡಗಳು ಇವೆ. ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಲೋಕಸಂಖ್ಯೆ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಹೆಚ್ಚಾಗೋದು, ಪಾಪ್ಯುಲೇಷನ್ ಗ್ರೋತ್. Perhaps the most important is the shift in agricultural crops, and urbanization and industrialization are the 4 obvious stressors. There are others also that are creating the kinds of problems that I showed you earlier with photographs. And I will just highlight the second one, agricultural crop shifts, by looking at where does the irrigation water go. Now, ನೀರಾವರಿಗೆ ನೀರನ್ನು ಕೊಡ್ತೀವಿ ರೈತರಿಗೆ, ಯಾವ ಬೆಳೆಗೆ ಈ ನೀರಾವರಿ ಹೆಚ್ಚಿನ ಅಂಶ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. So the highest consumer of irrigation water is paddy at 47% of the total irrigation water that is being supplied. And the next highest consumer is sugarcane at 24%. This is an absurd prioritization of a commercial crop with minimal nutritional value that is consuming the maximum amount of water. Yakandre irrigated area 16%, the share of sugarcane, but the consumption of water is 24%. And the share of sugarcane in total agricultural area is only 6%. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ರೈತಾಬಲ್ಲಿ ಇರತಕ್ಕಂತ ಕ್ಷೇತ್ರದಲ್ಲಿ 6% ಮಾತ್ರ ಕಬ್ಬಿನ ಕ್ಷೇತ್ರ ಇದ್ರೂ ಕೂಡ 26% ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಕಾಲ್ ಭಾಗ ನೀರಾವರಿ ನೀರು ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ನೀರಾವರಿ ನೀರು ಕಾಲ್ ಭಾಗ ಕಬ್ಬಿನ ಬೆಳೆಗೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಈ ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆ ನಮ್ಮ ನೀರಿನ ಕ್ಷೇತ್ರದಲ್ಲಿ. So related to this, why do we have these kinds of problems manifesting for decades together? Of course, there is the political economy of agriculture, and due to lack of time, I may not go much further except to point out the predominance of sugarcane farming in this sector as one of the highest water-consuming crops. But we also have the problem of fragmented knowledge and inadequate governance structure. And I'm going to use up the next maybe 10 minutes to quickly illustrate these 2 points. I will start with the idea of fragmented knowledge. ನಾವು ನೀರನ್ನು ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಲೋಪದೋಷಗಳಿವೆ. So we did this analysis of the decline of inflows into the TJ Halli reservoir. We asked the question, why is the decline happening given that it is not attributable to climate change? When we analyzed the data for 60 years, the rainfall had not declined. The temperature had not increased enough to really explain the kind of drop that we saw in the inflows. So we are left with the remaining 3 reasons, which is the increase in evapotranspiration in the catchment, and that was driven by a dramatic expansion of eucalyptus farming from 0% in 1970s to occupying almost 20% of the catchment. 20% of the catchment of the TJ Halli reservoir is occupied by eucalyptus, and that has caused a dramatic increase in evapotranspiration, consumptive use of water. And the second is the loss, the decline of the shallow aquifer, because of groundwater pumping, the drop in the level of the shallow aquifer means that the shallow aquifer no longer feeds the river, base flow is gone to zero, and that the data shows that indeed the base flow has gone to zero. But the third factor that I want to highlight is also the role of check dams. ಇದು ನೀರು ಅಂತರ್ಜಲ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಗೊತ್ತಾಯ್ತು. ಗೊತ್ತಾದ್ಮೇಲೆ ನಾವು ಏನ್ ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ? How did we respond to the decline of groundwater levels in the Arkavati catchment? We responded by building check dams. We have thousands of check dams in the Arkavati catchment that were built by different departments. What has that actually done? That has given temporary relief to the farmers near the check dams. As the check dams have recharged groundwater, they have converted surface flows into groundwater recharge, but the recharge has not stayed as recharge. Of course, it has been used by farmers for cultivating water intensive crops, as a result of which the groundwater levels continue to drop, and the inflows to the reservoir have been cut off because the surface flows get converted to recharge and then get used up by the farmer there itself, and no water is going, making its way downstream into the reservoir. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಚೆಕ್ ಡ್ಯಾಮ್ ಗಳನ್ನು ಕಟ್ಟಿದೀವಿ, ಇದು ಅಂತರ್ಜಲ ಇಳಿತಾ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಚೆಕ್ ಡ್ಯಾಮ್ ಅನ್ನು ಕಟ್ಟಿದ್ರೆ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಮೇಲಿನ ಜಲ ಅಂತರ್ಜಲಕ್ಕೆ ಸೇರುತ್ತೆ. ಆದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಪಂಪಿಂಗ್ ಮೇಲೆ ಯಾವುದೇ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಯಂತ್ರಣವನ್ನು ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿಲ್ಲ, ಅದರಿಂದ ಆ ನೀರು ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಪಂಪ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಮುಗಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ಆವಾಗ ನಮ್ಮ ಜಲಾಶಯಗಳಿಗೆ, ಕೆರೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಈ ನೀರು ಬರ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. So these are the three key reasons for the decline of these inflows, and this is a story across the landscape, probably not just in Karnataka but elsewhere. In other words, then, fragmented thinking, a temporary solution like building check dams and forgetting what are the interconnections of a single resource. Water is a single resource, it moves across the landscape in various ways. The hydro cycle is something that we have to keep in mind. We are not keeping in mind. So when we build check dams, we reduce surface runoff. When we do artificial recharge to borewells, again we reduce surface runoff. We are desilting tanks. We are spending thousands of crores of money in desilting tanks, but there are no inflows. So why are we increasing the size of the volume of the reservoir when in fact there is no inflow coming into the reservoir in the first place? And we are not diagnosing the reason for that declining inflow. We are recommending rooftop rainwater harvesting, which also not only cuts into runoff, but it is useful for domestic scale interventions. It also creates inequity because bigger the house, bigger the rooftop rainwater harvesting capacity. That means somebody living in a slum will never have access to that kind of water. And of course, we are building new dams every year, and that has implications downstream. We are an upstream state, which means that we have obligations to downstream communities within the state as well as outside the state. And finally, we are drilling more borewells, and that is only depriving future generations of access to groundwater, as well as the earlier work showed, it is depriving current farmers. So ನಾನು borewell ಜಾಸ್ತಿ borewellಗಳನ್ನು ಕೋರಿದ್ರೆ, if I dig more borewells, I actually often deprive my neighbor of access to groundwater because the neighbor will not have necessarily the affordability to drill 5 more borewells to a deeper level in order to access groundwater. So this is why the 2019 draft policy says that we require a paradigm shift in the water sector. From supply side management to demand side management, so we have to stop thinking in terms of building more dams because the resource is limited and we have already exhausted most of the possibilities of utilizing the resource. We are actually letting very little water go downstream beyond the obligations of interstate water treaties. The shift from fragmented management to integrated management that thinks of surface water, groundwater and wastewater as a single resource, from depleted groundwater for few people to restored groundwater for everybody. ಎಲ್ರಿಗೋಸ್ಕರ ನಾವು ಅಂತರ್ಜಲವನ್ನು ಮ್ಯಾನೇಜ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು, ಬರೀ ಕೆಲವರಿಗೆ ಮಾತ್ರ ಅಲ್ಲ ಅದು. And from wasting water to water efficient utilization, sector from a state-private dichotomy to the commons held in public trust, and from top-down to participatory management of the water sector. I'm going to now just elaborate a little bit on the last parts of the governance question, because if we want to face the challenge of managing water, whether we have climate change or we don't have climate change, whether climate change is going to increase rainfall or decrease rainfall, whether it's going to cause floods or droughts, we have to put our house in order, and the house that we need to put in order is the how do we govern water? How do we take decisions about managing water? And currently we have a very funny dichotomy or paradox where surface water is a state property. ನದಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹರಿಯತಕ್ಕಂತ ನೀರು ಅದು ರಾಜ್ಯ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಒಂದು. This is a funny paradox where one part of the resource is state property, and the other part of the resource is completely private property. And the decision making on the first part is highly centralized. Instead, we need a public trust doctrine which looks at all water, surface and ground, as a commons held in trust by the government on behalf of the people, which means that the method of decision making on all water has to be participatory and downwardly accountable in the governance system. And the strategies that the task group has suggested is, of course, reviving participatory irrigation management in the command areas and restructuring the corporations, the companies that were set up to manage the big dams, to make them much more downwardly accountable, and the non-command areas to be treated as a single unit of groundwater and watershed management in a participatory manner. So, ಎರಡು ಕಡೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಅಚ್ಚುಕಟ್ಟು ಪ್ರದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ಜನರ ಸಹಭಾಗಿತ್ವದಲ್ಲಿ ನೀರಿನ ಹಂಚಿಕೆ ಆಗಬೇಕು, ಅದು ಸಮಾನತೆಯ ಒಂದು ಧೋರಣೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಆಗಬೇಕು. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಕಡೆ ಅಚ್ಚುಕಟ್ಟು ಪ್ರದೇಶ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಬೇರೆ ಪ್ರದೇಶಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಹೆಚ್ಚಾಗಿ ಅಂತರ್ಜಲದ ಮೇಲೆ ಅವಲಂಬಿಸಿಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ, ವಾಟರ್ ಶೆಡ್ ಮ್ಯಾನೇಜ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೀವಿ, ವಾಟರ್ ಶೆಡಿಗೂ ಮತ್ತೆ ಅಂತರ್ಜಲಿಗೂ ನಾವು ಲಿಂಕ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಅದನ್ನು ಲಿಂಕ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಅಂತರ್ಜಲ ಎಲ್ಲರ ಹೊಣೆ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಆ ದೃಷ್ಟಿಯಿಂದ ಅದನ್ನ ಅಳವಡಿಸಬೇಕು. In cities, we should be thinking about integrated urban water management, and in order to allocate resources across the whole state between sectors and between different levels and of users, between agriculture and domestic and so on and so forth, we will need a water resources regulatory authority for doing an impartial allocation based upon certain framework principles. And the information that is required for this kind of allocation and for continued management, we would need a single water monitoring agency, not one agency which monitors groundwater and another which monitors surface water, and the data of neither are really in the public domain. So this in turn will require larger organizational reform, because currently the water department's mandates, their human resources, their structure and their way of functioning are from an era of dam construction. So the Water Resources Department of Karnataka, for example, has 3,000 or 5,000 engineers, and the groundwater, which is providing 40% to 60% of the water for the users, is actually managed by 300 staff in the groundwater directorate, half of which the posts are still empty. So we have to shift our whole way of organizing our water resources administration. We have to move the thinking from construction to regulation, which is done in an integrated manner, decentralized and people-oriented, which means we also need to separate the functions which are currently all sitting with one department: the function of regulation, the function of information provision, the function of bulk construction and supply, and the function of micro-level water management at the, say, village level, which has to be done by the Gram Panchayat or the Gram Sabhas of those villages. And finally, this will require us to think beyond engineering. I think this echoes Dr. Caroline's point that we should not be focusing on creating technicians. We have to be focusing on creating leaders who can interact with people and build the water governance system bottom up to ensure that it is participatory and it is just. So we cannot depend only on engineering training and geological training. And I call it training rather than the person, because people can change. It's the training that needs to change in order to expand their horizons. And in order to enable this, of course, we will require a legal reform, a straight water framework law, a revamped Participatory Irrigation Management Act, a parallel act for the non-command areas, a Water Resources Authority Act that acts as the higher level linking the two. And we have to, of course, amend the acts that regulate the many boards that have already been set up, because all these acts are about empowering these state structures to do certain things, but do not assign any responsibility on them. So the Bangalore Water Supply Board is empowered to provide water supply to the citizens of Bangalore, but it is not required to provide water supply to the city of Bangalore. Therefore, 40% of Bangaloreans still do not get Kaveri water. They have to make do with their own borewells or buying tanker water. So there is a real problem in the way we have constituted our boards, and that needs to change. So to summarize, it's not just about average availability as the goal, nor is it only about climate resilience, but we have multiple goals for the water sector that we need to keep in mind. And in particular, the goal of equity and justice is something that we have neglected for far too long, that needs to be brought up front. climate change will complicate matters, and I think my colleague Pradeep will show you in much more detail how climate change is complicating matters. But our systems are already stressed heavily, and therefore we have to understand where these stresses are coming from, and we have to bring about a paradigm shift in our thinking, adopt goals for the governance, change the goals for governance, the structures of governance, and the processes and organizations of governance, and the human beings in those governance systems, and build a much more participatory, bottom-up, and multi-layered democratic governance for the water sector. Thank you.